Okay, well, let's continue here. Chapter 22, in the previous video, I had some plot elements, and now we'll move on to the notes. As I said, as I started to introduce you to the idea of a narrative flow, time begins to move more quickly in the second half of the chapter. Tubin has been a doctor of divinity. That's a little more details. Like I said before, we get some background. And as recently as March. So this is like June-ish or so, and since March, so it only took him a few months to go completely crazy, which is, I thought, pretty interesting. It was the ensuing country that carried him off. So in other words, it was the land that drove him crazy, according to the narrator. So I don't know. That's an interesting notion. I don't know really what to make of that. But the land itself seems to drive men crazy, and it meshes itself in men, and they do it. In other words, is it the land that's making them do things, or is it them that sort of takes on the character? Do they make a conscious decision to sort of take on those choices? Who knows? There's a mixture of both. The judge, once again, becomes very philosophical, as he often does. He's very cynical. And again, his philosophy of war is something that was covered before in a big old speech that he gave. But if war, and he says specifically, if war is not holy, man is nothing more than antic clay. That's something interesting to take apart. In other words, if, according to the judge, the highest calling of man is to commit war, and I've already talked a little bit about, gone over a little bit about how that is or isn't, If you haven't heard that judge's speech on war in one of the previous units, then I suggest you do that, because that's kind of a famous little speech. But if war is not holy, if I'm wrong and this is not a holy thing, considering that this is the highest calling of man, then man is essentially meaningless. So if you follow me, the philosophy is that war is the highest measure of man. So the lower you lower the meaning of war, the lower you measure the meaning of man. Okay? That's the logic anyway. So the kid, after the operation, he does actually get operated on eventually after he sobers up, and in his semi-conscious state, he dips in and out of the operation. That's probably a little bit confusing as you're reading it through the narrative. He sees the judge, the blacksmith, and a coin counterfeiter. So there's some suggestion that the judge is sort of moving in and out of this forgery, right? I don't know if it says it directly, but there's a suggestion there that forgery seems to be very important to this new makeup of the judge himself. So in other words, if you think of it, if you want to move it forward to the idea of the dark web, right? It's like the judge would fit right in, right? He would be going for the dark web, and he would be finding ways to scam Bitcoin, and I don't know, he would be looking all sorts of stuff. But in the dark corners of the marketplace, the judge will exist. Okay, so in this case, it's counterfeiting, but you could sort of fill in the blanks from there. He's adapting, right, to this new chaotic order of civilization, right? It's not the chaotic, bloody civilization. It's the chaotic, bloody civilization of cities, right? So during the kid's post-West travels, and once again, the West is moving away now. It's sort of shutting down and trying to sort of close the door on that, that overt violence and savagery, and sort of maybe moving into a new era but still an era of chaos and violence. There's an ambiguity about this city that he's in, right? This quote-unquote city. He saw men killed with guns and with knives and with ropes. Women fought to the death, whose value they themselves set at $2. So essentially, whores, quote-unquote whores, as they're referred to here, prostitutes, right? So they put their value at, they charge $2 for their body, and, nothing seems to have changed, really. It's just sort of repositioned itself, right? And I think that's one of the suggestions that the narrator makes. There is still violence, but under a new guidance or purpose, okay? The purpose of settling, now that we've established that we're here and we've gotten rid of everything that would conflict with our vision of the world, we're trying to put a little bit of the idea of order. So, of the judge, as far as the judge goes, the kid hears rumors of him everywhere. He's become sort of this legendary figure, which brings to mind, maybe there's a little bit of stuff going on in terms of elaborating on the truth of everything, right? There's sort of a legend going on here. The judge is already becoming a legend, and the kid himself is treated with a certain kind of deference, right? So if you can imagine in this sort of more civilized order, there's probably stories going around about the past, right? About the pre-settled era, right? The Wild West, right? This is where the tales of the Wild West are starting to come in, and so they're building up these really savage, bloody, purposeless people into a legendary kind of, oh, they were gunslingers out in the West, killing Injuns and settling things for the settlers, and they would come in and rescue people. It's like we know that's not true in this book, but the kid himself is sort of like, oh, that's one of those mean gunslinger guys, and so if you can imagine, like, they're sitting there going, hey, is he one of those guys? One of those tough guys, don't mess with him, like he's seen things, right? But we know the reality of it is that it's a lot messier than how they want to make it out. Moving on to chapter 24, which is getting really close to the ending here, if not the ending. They begin it begins with a trapper telling the kid of the slaughter extinction of the buffalo. So there's a historical name check here about the buffalo. It was one of the ways that they would settle the West. They meaning the westward expansion, the whites, the civilized folk, right? They would come out and they would not just sort of defeat the natives in battle. They would actually kill their food source. These buffalo, wild buffalo that used to roam the plains. They would slaughter them. There used to be millions of them. There would be acres and acres of them, but now there's just lots of bones, right? Because they're just sort of left rotting in the sun. Because there was a bounty on actually killing buffaloes at one point, because for a variety of reasons, but one of them is that A, trophy hunting, but B, and probably more importantly, is that you get rid of the food and the things that that the natives require sustenance with. If you get rid of that, you get rid of them, right? You get rid of their culture. He encounters bone pickers, people who make their living picking through these bones, essentially, and, piling them up and then selling them, for whatever purposes. There's a 15-year-old that argues with the kid, and the kid shoots him. You shouldn't have lived anyway. So you can imagine this is a new kid, right? We encountered the kid before, and now there's a new kid, and maybe part of our narrative expectation is that this kid is gonna, in like any action movie or in a Hollywood movie, right? We would see the kid, and it's like, oh, this guy's like me, and so I will teach him the ways of man, right? Because you're a kid like I was. No, he just shoots him, right? So there's no romanticism here, right? The romanticism of the West is in other words, is confronting us. Is confronting us in a negative way, meaning there is no romanticism according to the kid. But maybe in the story that we would read about it, that is a more traditional story, that would lead to a different ending. So there's a dancing bear that's kind of a really sad moment that gets shot in a bar. But it does lead to the ending. It's sort of a symbolic movement into this ending where there's a final encounter with a judge. Lots of references to the dance. I guess in a perfect world, I would ask you what that means, what he means by the dance. But since this is not a perfect world, you can think of that as a more poetic thing. I offer some suggestions about what it might mean. Here's some here's some checks on what the judge refers to as the dance. He says there's plenty of time for the dance. What man would not be a dancer if he could? This is orchestration for an event, for a dance, in fact. So he's talking about literally a dance, but he might also be talking about the whole idea, that whole idea of fatalism and nihilism that I've been throwing at you a little bit. Is this all part of the dance? So my big question usually is, there's two moments in this book that get asked a lot that don't really have answers. One of them that probably has a closer answer is the dance. What is the dance? And is it connected to ceremony? Remember that idea of that ceremony, the ceremony itself of whatever you're trying to symbolize. It's actually the meaning in and of itself. What I mean by that is like, a ceremony of puberty, right? It's not so much the action itself that you're taking, whatever it is. Cultures vary in terms of what specific things they have to do physically in order to move through this ceremony. But the ceremony itself is important, right? Just accomplishing that ceremony tells you about the culture rather than what it's ushering you into. So In class, I would normally have people read a little bit of 342 and then 347. They're both references to the dance, but I'll go in here and read a little bit off to you so that I can leave you with some ideas here. He stood up at the edge of the dance floor. A ring of people had taken the floor and were holding hands and grinning and calling out to one another. A fiddler sat on a stool on the stage, and a man walked up and down, calling out the order of the dance, gesturing and stepping in the way he wished them to go. Outside, in the darkened lot, groups of wretched Tonkawas stood in the mud, and their faces composed in strange lost portraits within the sashwork of the window lights. So if you can imagine this, very, it's a dance in a bar that's being watched, that's very kind of dimly lit by candlelight, and it almost seems like a little bit of a ceremony, right? So, and then I'll skip over to the end, and they were dancing, the board floor slamming under the jackboots, and the fiddlers grating hideously over their canted pieces. Towering over them all is the judge, and he is naked, dancing, his small feet lively and quick, and now in double time, and bowing to the ladies, huge and pale and hairless, like an enormous infant. He never sleeps, he says, and he'll never die. He bows to the fiddlers and sashays backwards and throws back his head and laughs deep in his throat. And he is a great favorite, the judge. He wafts his hat, and the lunar dome of his skull passes palely under the lamps, and he swings about and takes possession of one of the fiddles, and he pirouettes and makes a pass. 2 passes, dancing and fiddling at once. His feet are light and nimble. He never sleeps. He says that he will never die. He dances in light and in shadow, and he is a great favorite. He never sleeps, the judge. He is dancing. He says that he will never die. Dun-dun-dun-dun. Anyway, as you can see, that's not really a spoiler because, I guess, sort of a spoiler because the judge lives on. But I won't tell you about the other surprise. One of the things that you might also want to look at that doesn't really have an answer is what happens to the kid. I don't think I'm speaking out of turn to say that that scene is sort of the ending of the story in reality. But that's something that you might want to take a look at, just sort of figure out the sequence of events that happens. This is just sort of the last little poetic vision of the judge, and it seems almost like it's dreamlike. I don't know. That's sort of what the language tells me, right? He'll never die, and they talk about him, and it's just the narrator kind of going off on sort of this poetic image of the judge, and I think that's what the book wants to leave you with. As a last image, but you might want to walk through maybe the plot elements a little bit more deliberately and see if that helps you. Okay, so I'm hoping that this all has helped you. I do this not again. My last warning: this is not comprehensive, meaning it's not everything in the chapter, right? For that, you would have to read the book. I'm just highlighting certain things that I think will help guide you. And I'm hoping that you can see sort of this linear progression and this consistency of vision in terms of the lens that I'm asking you to look at. And that's kind of all I really need you to get out of these particular lectures. This is not a lecture-heavy class overall, but I do think that probably this book requires a little bit of a judicious selection in what you're going to focus on. So that's why I put this together. Because there's just way too much here, right? I could teach a whole class just on this book, and and if we were in a literature class, we could spend a lot more time on sort of the language and sort of how it works. But at this point, I just want you to use it in a composition class as something as evidence of some final understanding that you're going to come to. Okay? So once again, I hope this has been helpful. Thank you very much. See you guys later.